Thank you for joining the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston for our weekly online ministers forum. I'm the Reverend Dr. Colin Bossen, Senior Minister of the congregation. These programs are conversations with community organizers, scholars, religious leaders, and artists and others about how we can collectively address the present crises. Their purpose is to offer members of our community and all who wish to join us online science-based resources and liberation-oriented inspiration to get us through these difficult times. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Nate Holdren, Assistant Professor of Law, Politics, and Society at Drake University. We will be talking about democracy in the workplace. Dr. Holdren has a PhD in history from the University of Minnesota. His scholarship focuses on the relationship between law, class, and capitalism. His recent book, published in 2020 with Cambridge University Press, is Injury Impoverished: Workplace Accidents, Capitalism, and Law. We hope you find that these forums a source of connection, hope, and clarity. Nate, thank you for joining us. Your most recent book focuses primarily on employment injury law. I think some of our viewers might think of this as a somewhat obscure subject, but you make a persuasive argument that understanding it is important for learning exactly how, for most working people, the United States is not really a democracy. So could you start out by explaining what employment injury law is and how you came to be interested in it?
Thank you for that. One of the things I wanted to do, I wanted to just show you the cover. That's my book. And this is on the inside flap. That's a picture that one of my kids drew of me. The book doesn't have an author photo, so my kid drew the author photo of me, and then down here below is the larger photograph that the cover is taken from. And this is a photo of some children whose parents died family members died in a mining disaster that I write about in the book. And actually was only today, preparing for this, that I realized that I have this on the back of the book. I have this juxtaposition of this cute thing that my kid made, a picture of me, alongside this photo of this children who suffered this terrible loss. And that's in a way part of what the book is about.
Well, that's a very poignant juxtaposition, and on some level a horrifying and good jumping off point to talking about, your book is about employment injury law, which I think for many people is going to seem like a pretty obscure subject. I've done a lot of union organizing in my life, so I've spent a fair amount of time in various contexts thinking about employment injury law, but I think most people I know probably have not. And you make a persuasive argument in your book, however, that it's important for people to understand how employment injury law works, because it reveals that for most working people, the United States really is not much of a democracy, at least not in our working lives. So I was wondering if you could just start as a point to talk about what employment injury law is and how you came to be interested in it.
One of the things I tried to do in the book was just to talk about what an injury is. And that may sound weird, but it's actually kind of hard to say, like, what an injury is for somebody, because if somebody gets their fingers caught in a machine, I talk about people in the book who this happens to, people get their fingers caught in a machine and they're being crushed and burnt for a long period of time. And is that a loss of income? Is that a loss of, is it time spent suffering? It can be damage to your sense of self. So like I have kids. If I lose my arms, I'm not going to be able to hug my kids anymore. I'm not going to be able to play guitar anymore. I'm not going to be able to draw anymore. Parts of how I see myself as a person, parts of my relationships are changed. And people can go on after traumatic injury to live rich lives and so on. But I wanted my book to draw out that injuries are very multifaceted, because human beings are multifaceted. Mm. And then people end up in a system of law that is not very multifaceted and is very kind of boils people down and reductive and treats people's complex injury and complex lives in this very simplified way. And I wanted the book to make clear some of that multifaceted complexity, and to name the various kinds of vulnerability that people have, to the degree that I know how to, and then to show how the law tramples on all that complexity and all that multifaceted human dignity. And in a way, I mean, this is stuff that someone with your training will have an easier time naming. You're better at human singularity and human ineffability than I am. I'm a historian, but and I don't have the kind of training that you do. But I tried to the best of my abilities. I wanted the book to sort of draw that out for people. That there's this, what happens, what is an injury is really complicated. Similarly, you'd ask me what's employee injury law, and I think employee injury law is partly it's relational. So for workers, it's often their best option, but it's really their least bad option in times of being very vulnerable, either because they got hurt or a loved one got hurt. And for employers, it's often a cost that they're trying to get out of.
Mm-hmm.
And for government economic planning officials, it's often injury law as a way to regulate gross domestic product. It's a way to regulate labor markets and the rate at which children stay in school or leave school because of poverty. And so it's a form of promoting social efficiency and social order. And so injury law sort of mediates between those different populations in complicated ways. And it is something different for each of those populations. And my interests are mostly in the what it means for workers. And it's also wanted the book to draw out, here are the options that are offered to people, and then even the best options are still fall short of what I think, what you and I think of as what human dignity deserves.
Well, I think one thing that maybe important to talk about here is just how many people get injured at work. And
Absolutely.
so you have some very horrific examples, but you also open the book with an anecdote about how you got injured at work. And you have these two concepts that you sort of use to structure the book: the tyranny of the trial and the tyranny of the table, and sort of talking about how there's a sort of a regime shift in these two different kinds of tyrannies. Like this period before 1910 is when you have what you call the tyranny of the trial, and then after that, the tyranny of the table. And I'd like you to talk about both those, but I think that in that shift, but one of the things that's I think most important is this concept of tyranny, right? Because we don't really, I mean, if you listen to the rhetoric of the United States, it's so much about freedom and democracy. I mean, although Donald Trump was a very interesting exception in this case, but which we could talk about more in a different context, perhaps. But it's freedom and free enterprise and democracy and all of this stuff, and yet functionally, most working people don't have a democratic experience throughout their daily lives. So, if you could sort of talk about these two different kinds of tyrannies and why you choose to use the word tyranny as opposed to you could have chosen a different word that would be much less highlighting of the anti-democratic nature of the workplace, right? You could have chosen a word decision by trial, decision by table, right? Because what is happening is people are making decisions about how workplace injuries are going to be decided, right? So but you chose this word tyranny.
So in order to get money, we have to. A lot of us, we have to have jobs, or we have to have a relationship with someone who has a job, and so that's compulsory, and so it's not democratic. And in the and that sounds really abstract, but in the cases I looked at in the injury suits and so on, it was very, very common that people would be like, I don't feel comfortable on this machine, and a supervisor would say, well, you have to be on this machine because otherwise we'll fire you. You know, that tyranny is a real thing that directly appeared in workplaces and led to people taking risks and getting injured that they would not otherwise want to take. And so I did not want the book. I think it's a common pattern that an improvement happens. I'm all for improvements. I want working class people. I want everyone to have a great life. But I think it's very common. There's an ugly pattern where there's an improvement that then runs cover for ongoing injustice. So I think we've seen elements of this in the COVID pandemic where there's a safety improvement and we're told, look, this is safer. And then there's a slippage of now it's safe, so take this risk. And I think there's a similar pattern of like, here, look, things are a little better now, so shut up about the ways that they still fall short of human dignity. So that's why it's a tyranny of the trial, because I wanted to say here is one sort of dictatorship that people live under, and it's absolutely unacceptable, and then tyranny of the table, and here is a different dictatorship that people live under, and it is absolutely morally unacceptable. And if we juxtapose the two, they shed light on each other in a hopefully in an intellectually productive way to just understand these realities. And you said a moment ago about just the scale and the quantity of injuries. And in the early 20th century, the data collection was not very good. The best estimate I've read was by a guy who was a statistician. And in 1913, he estimated that about 1 in every 10 workers would lose a body part at work at some time in their working life. Injury rates are lower now than today in 2020, but still the average is about 5,000 people a year in the U.S. Die in a fatal injury or a fatal workplace illness. It's probably much higher now under the COVID pandemic, but that the data collection is also bad. OSHA is deliberately not really tracking that. And there's about not quite 3 million Americans suffer a very serious injury every year at work. In the global economy, about 5,000 people every day die from work, either an injury or occupational illness. So it remains an incredibly violent kind of a thing. And when I've said this to folks, I sometimes get this thing of, well, 5,000 people is unfortunate, but we have a big economy. And I think, that there's a politics to that. Again, I love your point earlier about ontology. There's a politics to that, a kind of political ontology to that of like, what's a lot of death? Like how many, there's a, how many, I can't remember the name of the film. There's a great film on this about the AIDS epidemic where someone says, you want us to lose all this money, someone with insurance companies, you want us to lose all this money over just a handful of dead hemophiliacs? And this guy from the FDA loses his temper and he shouts. He's like, how many dead hemophiliacs do you need before you take death seriously? So I think like that, that's part of what I want to do in the book, is to be like, every human being is a world, so every human death ought to be a reason to pause. And I think there's and I don't think it was deliberate. It's not a conspiratorial book, but I think there's something that happened in the processes of the law working that kind of created this injury is acceptable, injury is boring, injury law is boring, injury is inevitable, injury is small. Oh, only 5,000 workers.
Well, I mean, I think that there are a lot of things we could think about as to why that happens and what the law does. I mean, I think that a point I recently made at a talk that I gave at Rice and that I'm developing into a journal article right now is that the law has truly become secular theology in the United States. It has truly become like Jesuit casuistry in the 14th century, where you have a group of very learned people who sit around all day trying to figure out the nature of being and then trying to structure the rest of society along those lines. And the thing that's like particularly true about that parallel is that in both cases, everybody else thought that the stuff that they were talking about was like totally weird and uninteresting. I mean, like your average like 13th century, 14th century medieval peasant in Europe was not spending great deals of time, although I guess that's thinking about what Thomas Aquinas had to say in the Summa Theologica, right? I mean, it just was not what was happening. And like, sure, people like you and me probably read some court cases here and there, or I mean, you read a lot of court cases because you teach law, but most people don't. And certainly, the the vast majority of us don't think about the ways in which, like, I even call them secular theologians in the courts are like literally trying to adjudicate on the nature of being itself.
Well, there's some old notion I remember from an intro philosophy class of like this is the best possible world, and I think that's part of what the law does is like say like this is as good as it gets, just accept it, shut up, stop thinking, go back to work.
But so you have this figure of 5,000 people a year are dying in the United States, and 3 million people a year are injured. And I think that one thing that's super important to highlight, and that just because it has such political resonance and doesn't ever get talked about in any sort of real sense. I live in Houston, Texas, and in my neighborhood I often take walks because that's what one does in the time of COVID. And there are all these Blue Lives Matter flags around. And, there's this myth, and it really is a myth that being a police officer is like this really dangerous job.
Yes.
And we should like be really, super protective and appreciative of our police officers because they do such dangerous work.
Yes.
Well, the truth of the matter is, being a police officer is not a dangerous job at all. There are more bartenders. Like if you go look at the Department of Labor statistics, there are more bartenders who die every year than police officers in work-related injuries, right? And so
absolutely, taxi drivers, 7-Eleven clerks, absolutely,
right? So there's all these jobs that like, so we could have an interesting conversation, I think, about like, okay, maybe some jobs are more important than others, or we should be supporting people who do certain kinds of work differently. But the myth that this particular kind of work is more dangerous, which is actually a myth that is then used to justify killing thousands of people a year, well, over 1,000 people a year in terms of people who are killed by police, right? Is just not, not true. So I think that thinking about the sort of moral, what is the moral argument being made by making these claims?
Yeah.
Personally, for me, I'm fairly skeptical of policing broad strokes for a whole lot of different reasons, including how effective it is in addressing the problems it's supposed to address. But I'm very appreciative of, say, the fisher folk or delivery drivers. I used to organize bike messengers, for God's sakes, and talk about a job with a high incidence of fatalities.
I hadn't really thought about it in these terms exactly, but I think the gut impulse behind part of the book was that there are implicit moral arguments that we're kind of enrolled in, or that the law is kind of enrolled in and wants us to think about. I use this term in the book. I talk about the social imagination of the law and the moral imagination of the law. And the social imagination, what I mean by that is the degree to which the law accurately or inaccurately gives us a map of power relationships. And so I say that society is significantly less democratic, and there's much more power in the employment relationship than the law lets on. And then the moral imagination was, to what degree does the law adequately capture what I was saying before about the manifold realities of injury. And I think that we live in these contexts that imply people may not think this stuff in exactly those terms, but they might as well. And the law, probably no one sat down and said, let's design a legal system that no one consciously constructed a legal system that treats workers as just objects and so on, but they might as well have. And so that was also what I wanted the book to bring out, was like that, these are real things in the world, like these are real patterns with moral stakes. And if we care about things like human dignity and so on, then if we start to think in that way, then these apparently acceptable things really look differently. And so you talked about sort of who gets hurt. Yeah, and and then I think there's like different scripts that are available. So like in a numerical sense, police are not in a particularly dangerous job. In another sense, like I don't feel good if I hear that. I don't want police to be. I think we should cut police funding. I like the slogan that came up over the summer. Abolish police and so on. But that said, it's still not a good thing if a police officer gets hurt either. I'm not for that. And I think so, but we have a vocabulary, Blue Lives Matter. I think I don't agree with the politics that's bound up in, but that is an attempt to express the dignity of a human life in a specific way. And like we have this around veterans, and veterans are poorly treated as well, but there were scripts at least to make that. There may be bad. I think there's like a morality play. There are the kind of bad morality plays around those things, but there's at least a morality play written. There's at least a script. And for a lot of the other kinds of death and injury that happen, there's like not even a publicly available script. And that was also one of the and there. That's with what I call the tyranny of the trial and the old lawsuit-based system of employee injury law. There were some scripts for some kind of morality plays written for how to talk about injury and how to process that. And with the shift to workers' comp, all of that basically disappeared. And now how to handle injury is largely, there's been some developments after the book ends, because the book ends in the 30s, but there's some developments after. But for the most part, we still don't have a clear public script. What does it mean when a worker dies? We talk about, as you said, kind of wrongly, we talk about police as this people who undergo numerically frequent risks of injury, and they're public servants. But when we don't have a script that, postal workers serve the public, teachers serve the public, teachers get hurt at work. Everyone, like you said, the fisher folk, everyone who grows food is serving society by growing food. And we don't have a script for those injuries. They're largely just invisible.
I don't think most people understand that much of the reason why the Congress has not passed a second stimulus bill or whatever we want to call it to address the pandemic is precisely because of disagreements about employment injury law, which is that the current Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, is dead set that there will be no second stimulus unless there is legislation in the that's passed that says that employers will not be held liable for exposing people to COVID. Not people, sorry, their workers to COVID. And so right now, literally millions of people are at risk for losing their houses, are dealing with food insecurity, and are unable to make safe choices about sheltering in place or staying home or social distancing, whatever language we want to call, because of a dispute.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and also just to add to that, in the kind of the spirit I was trying to say before, with the kind of give a full spectrum account, people then have to live with that fear. So there's the threat, and there's also the fear of kind of knowing the clock is ticking. Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of the things that's so galling to me about that is how gratuitous it is, because the law is not very good. It's not going to be large penalties. It's not going to be large amounts of money. For example, with OSHA, now that's it's related, but it's not the same. But with OSHA, as of the end of August, OSHA had given out like 5 citations, and they've given 2 for meatpacking. Meatpackers have been getting sick in incredibly large numbers, and they've had like 200 meatpackers have died, and OSHA has fined 2 companies $29,000 total. Those 2 companies are worth $29 billion. So the fine is nothing for their total revenue. So McConnell's is holding up all of this, and it's really a thing where it's like, am I going to earn 20% on my $1 million or 18%? So it's like, like the human stakes for working people are astronomical, and the amounts of money that are on the table for employers are also astronomical, but they're for people who already are making astronomical amounts of money. It's deeply inhumane. And there's also been initiatives at the state level. So Iowa, where I live right before I moved here, made its workers' comp law much, much worse. And they did it in this really terrible way. And they talked about it in this smug way of like, oh, well, liberals think that the arm isn't part of the shoulder. But what they really did is they said, if you lose your arm at above the elbow, but you still have a shoulder, you don't count as having lost an arm, so you get less money. You have to lose your whole shoulder now under the law in Iowa to have it count as losing your shoulder. And what that really means is that someone who's endured an appalling injury will now get like a third as much money. That's fundamentally what that means. And Iowa then more recently also was one of the first states to pass a COVID liability shield. And again, it means people who make very little money, who are very, very vulnerable, who already are exposed to danger in their workplaces, now are going to get sick, potentially be disabled for life, potentially die. And so their employer can avoid like a $10,000 payment or a $100,000 payment. And it's a political decision. Again, I love your point about ontology. It's a political decision to focus costs on already very vulnerable, already suffering people, and to call that, oh, just dollars and cents, and to pretend that's not what's happening. It's absolutely unconscionable. And I sometimes think, how do people like that sleep at night? And I think that probably the ways the law talks about this in such value neutral terms is part of how they sleep at night, because they don't have to think of themselves as doing things that are wrong. They think of themselves as affecting, fiscal revenue or something.
Well, that would be a very long conversation about alienation and capitalism and sort of what we suffer under. And so I think that we better move on to a different question.
Another time. I'm for it. Another time.
What strategies would people, I mean, and this is obviously a vast subject, but what strategies would you want people to think about using to improve their working lives?
Certainly. So fundamentally, I think it's unionization. I think people coming together through collective action, and I think that can take a wide variety of forms. And I know that you had an earlier forum with Marianne from the Organizing Work website. There's a lot of good resources there. But to my mind, what I try to talk about in the book is, and I try to push against a thing among kind of lawyers and legislators, that I don't think these are primarily problems that we lawyer our way out of,
Mm-hmm.
and I think they're only minimally problems we legislate our way out of. I use this analogy of upstream and downstream. I don't remember if I say it in the book, but I use it a lot when I talk about the book, that employee injury law is fundamentally a problem. Employee injury law is fundamentally a body of law that addresses problems that are really far downstream from their social origins. And so really what needs to happen, in a way, my book is kind of about pollution, right? So like, I live in Des Moines, which is in central Iowa. There's a major problem with agricultural pesticide and fertilizer runoff from several counties north of here. And Des Moines municipality can't do anything about it because the municipality has no control over those upstream counties. Similarly, employee injury law deals with all of these harms that are produced as a result of the fact of market dependency, the fact of undemocratic work, and so on. And so I think we should, straightforward, we should give people more money when they get hurt. There's a number of things that we could do along those lines to make injury law better. Just like the city of Des Moines could introduce better filters in houses to mitigate the problems of water quality. But really, real change involves reaching further upstream, which I think is fundamentally going to mean, at the end of the day, workers coming together, taking collective action to control their own workplaces and control production broadly. That's a tall order. Now, that's not an easy fix. But, just like pollution, there's not an easy. I don't know that it's a conceptually complicated fix, but it's really hard, to actually pull off. So
it's very hard. Well, I feel like there must be a segment of folks out there from my congregation at this point who think that my answer to everything is, well, we should just organize.
Yeah. Do the right thing. Yeah.
Right.
But I mean, that is the answer. It's just really, really challenging. I mean, somebody said to me a long time ago, it took a long time for things to get as bad as they are now. This was in the context of an organizing campaign in my own workplace. It took years for things to get this bad. It's not going to get better overnight. And, we were talking about this before we started recording. At the scales that we live with, it's hard as we get older with kids and stuff. It's hard to live with that. Hard to be patient. But I do think that's the honest answer. I think we're called to be honest. So.
Well, actually, I mean, maybe this is a great note to end on. I have been thinking recently, there's a sort of like joke that, and I don't know how much of a joke it is, but there's like a joke that like every preacher has just one message. That they're like, and I've been thinking about that recently just because, I don't know, because I've been thinking about preaching. I'm always thinking about preaching.
Sure.
But, I was like, that's probably true for me. My one message is salvation is social. Like, that's it. Like, I talk about a lot of other things. I think about a lot of other things. But, like, at the end of the day, if I could just help 10 people in the world realize that salvation is social, I'll be pretty happy.
Yeah, I like that. And I guess one way to think how my book relates, I think my book supports that. And I think one of the things I try to do in the book is to say, here are, whatever if salvation is social in the kind of like fallen world that we live in, my book is trying to say, let me give you some details on exactly why this is unacceptable. And that this is, if you take a full look in the face, maybe that underscores why that social salvation is so urgent. Yeah, I like that a lot. Salvation is social. I'm going to remember that. Thank you for that.
Well, thank you, Nate, for joining us. I found this conversation to be both stimulating and actually quite important. So I really appreciate your time and your willingness to be with me and with the congregation and our viewers virtually. For those of you who have been watching, if you found this video to be helpful, I hope you'll consider joining us for our weekly online worship service. It's posted each Sunday at 10:30 a.m. Central and features music, prayers, in addition to a sermon. This week I'll be talking about passing the flame. Thank you to our staff for making this video possible. It was produced by Christian Holmes. Alma Viscar assisted with the editing. We'll see you all online soon and in person as soon as possible for us to gather again. And please remember that no matter how isolated you feel, we are all in this together.